Valentine's Day, the blood-red bouquet. Clara had been waiting for this day, counting down the hours since the moment Leo had asked her out a year ago. A year together, her first real relationship since the disaster that had been her last one. She was determined to make this Valentine's Day perfect. They were in their new apartment now, their first place together, and Leo had promised that this would be the day they'd make memories that would last forever. Everything seemed right. Until it didn't. Clara had a nagging feeling, something gnawing at the back of her mind. She chalked it up to the nerves of a special occasion, the excitement of being in love. It was supposed to be a day of romance after all. But as she walked up to Leo's apartment, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. The street was empty, the usual hum of city traffic stilled under a heavy, thick fog. It was as if the air itself had been drained of life. She adjusted the strap of her bag, forcing a smile, trying to shake off the chills. Valentine's Day was meant to be about love, after all, about joy and celebration, not fear. The building loomed ahead, and she stepped inside. The hallway was eerily quiet, the soft thud of her heels the only sound breaking the silence. She reached Leo's door, pausing briefly to smooth her jacket and check her reflection in the brass doorknob. Her fingers hesitated over the handle. It was unlocked. Clara pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside, expecting the warm, welcoming atmosphere Leo always created. But instead the apartment was cold. Too cold. The warmth that usually greeted her was absent, and the dim lighting gave the place an unsettling, almost foreboding atmosphere. There was a faint smell of roses, Leo's favorite flower, of course, but it wasn't the usual sweet fragrance she was accustomed to. No, this was sharper, almost metallic, as if something had died beneath the petals. "Leo?" she called out. The word bounced back to her from the empty corners of the apartment. "Leo, are you here?" There was no response. A strange weight pressed down on her chest as she moved through the room. The living room was barely illuminated by the soft glow of a few candles. Everything seemed wrong. The furniture, arranged as usual, looked oddly out of place, as if someone had just moved it into position without a care for symmetry. The entire apartment felt off-center, like it was slanting slightly. Her eyes were drawn to the coffee table at the center of the room. The bouquet of roses caught her attention immediately. They were huge, far too large for the small vase they were crammed into. Their petals were unnaturally dark, so dark they were almost black. But when Clara looked closer, she saw the deep blood-red hue beneath. The roses glistened, as though coated in something sticky, something alive. The thorns were long and twisted, curling in on themselves like claws. She felt a shiver run down her spine. They looked like something from a nightmare. She reached out to touch one. As soon as her fingertips brushed against the petal, a shock of cold shot up her arm, making her yank her hand back. A strange, buzzing hum seemed to vibrate in the air around her. "What's going on?" Clara looked around, suddenly aware of how cold the room had gotten. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, staring at the roses. Something about them felt wrong. They seemed almost alive. "Leo?" Her voice trembled, but she wasn't sure why. Something was off. The roses, the air, the stillness. "Leo?" There was a faint noise from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. "Clara?" The voice was low and soft, almost a whisper, but Clara recognized it immediately. "Leo!" She spun toward the hallway, where the shadow of his figure stood, barely visible in the dim light. He was standing perfectly still, but there was something strange in the way he looked. He didn't move, didn't speak again. His face was blank. "Leo?" Clara repeated, her voice softer this time, more uncertain. "What's going on? Why are you just standing there?" He didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his figure slowly stepping into the light. Clara's breath hitched. His eyes were dark, empty. The room seemed to grow colder still, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long, as though they were reaching toward her. Leo's expression was flat, lifeless. His lips curved into a smile, but it was a wrong smile, too wide, too sharp, as if it had been carved onto his face. His features no longer looked soft and human but grotesque, twisted. "Leo?" Clara took a step back, her heart racing. "What's happening?" He didn't speak at first, but the silence was deafening, and as the seconds passed, Clara felt herself sinking deeper into an unbearable tension. His grin stretched wider, his black eyes empty, sucking the light from the room. "I've been waiting," he murmured in a voice that wasn't his, deep, guttural, and wrong. The words were like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. "Waiting for you." Clara's body went rigid, her mind whirling in confusion. She stared at Leo, searching his face for any hint of the man she loved, but it was gone. Something dark, something ancient was looking back at her. "What is Weller?" "Lady Kier, what are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Leo, this isn't you." He tilted his head slightly, his smile growing even wider. "No, Clara, it's always been me. You just didn't know." The shadows in the room seemed to swirl, moving, undulating. Clara's head spun as her gaze was drawn to the roses once again. They were moving, twitching, writhing, like they were alive. The petals fluttered, and the stems flexed in unnatural ways, and then she heard it. Faint at first, but growing louder. A whispering voice, coming from the roses. It was a chorus of voices, echoing, twisting, chanting her name. "Clara, Clara, Clara!" She recoiled, feeling the blood drain from her face. What are they?" "You're not meant to ask questions, Clara," Leo said, his voice no longer human. It was deep, malevolent. "You're meant to belong." Before she could respond, she felt a pressure on her chest, a sudden crushing weight that forced her backward. She gasped for breath as if the very air around her was thickening, suffocating her. The roses were calling her, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, and now they weren't just voices, it was screams. Her head swam with the sound of 1,000 tortured souls, echoing from the flowers, from the walls, from Leo. "No!" Clara gasped, her body shaking. She turned toward the door, trying to break free. "I need to get out of here." She rushed toward the exit, her hand trembling as she grabbed for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Her heart thundered in her chest as she pulled harder, panic setting in. The roses on the table seemed to pulse, their stems now reaching out like tendrils, wrapping around her, and the petals unfurled, revealing sharp, jagged thorns, gleaming like knives. "Clara!" Leo's voice was right behind her, a low growl. "You can't leave!" Her hands flew to her throat as the roses began to constrict, pulling her toward the table. "Leo, please!" she screamed. "What are you doing to me?" Leo took another step toward her, his grin stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were no longer human. "I told you, Clara," he rasped. "You belong to me now. You've always belonged to me." Clara struggled, her vision spinning. The thorns were digging deeper into her skin, cutting through her clothes, drawing blood. The roses were eating her, devouring her. She could feel them tugging at her very soul, pulling her into the darkness, into the void of whatever it was Leo had become. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was Leo's empty eyes, still locked onto hers, and the roses, now alive, writhing, hungry, closing in around her. The end. Or perhaps not. The apartment was found abandoned the following morning. No signs of struggle, no explanation for the disappearance of Leo and Clara. The police searched, but no one found anything, except for the bouquet of blood-red roses. Ernokola. They sat on the coffee table, now completely black, their petals shriveled and twisted as if they'd been rotting for days. The thorns had grown longer, more jagged. And the whispers? The whispers were still there. As the building's new tenants moved in a few weeks later, they couldn't help but notice the faint, eerie hum that filled the apartment late at night. The flowers were always there, waiting, hungry, and the whispers called out to anyone who dared to listen. Askaval oso, kuruti votu, disifinismusin yo lusisisinyo. Clara. Weeks passed since Clara disappeared, but the apartment at 312 Oakwood Lane never seemed quite the same. Despite no one being able to explain what happened that night, whispers started to circulate. The neighbors spoke of strange noises late at night, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Faint scratching at the door, a low hum, like some kind of mechanical drone vibrating in the walls. Some of the more superstitious tenants swore they'd heard footsteps when they knew no one was home. And then there were the roses. No one knew what had happened to the bouquet that had been sitting on the coffee table the night Clara disappeared, but it was clear to anyone who entered that the apartment had a strange atmosphere. A cold, suffocating presence that seemed to cling to every corner, a lingering darkness that refused to leave. It was as if the apartment itself had absorbed whatever malevolent force had consumed Leo and Clara. New tenants moved in, of course. It wasn't easy to rent a place in the city, and Oakwood Lane was prime real estate despite its eerie reputation. The apartment was refurbished, fresh coats of paint, new fixtures, the usual attempts to erase the past and make it new again. But there were still traces of the old apartment, fragments of a nightmare that couldn't be scrubbed away. When the newest tenants, a young couple named Emily and Jason, moved in, they were excited. They were both young professionals, full of hope and ambition, and the apartment seemed perfect. Spacious, with a modern look and great views. Emily had heard rumors about the previous tenants, of course, but Jason had insisted they were just stories. Ghosts didn't exist. Bad things didn't happen to normal people. But the moment they stepped inside the apartment, both of them felt it. The coldness that seemed to settle in their bones, the strange emptiness that hung in the air. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something darker, a weight pressing down on them, almost as if the very walls of the apartment were holding their breath. They tried to ignore it. The first night they spent in the apartment was peaceful enough, but by the second night, things started to get strange. Emily woke up in the middle of the night to a soft whisper. It was a faint sound at first, just on the edge of her hearing, like someone murmuring in the next room. She thought it was just the wind or the pipes, but when she rolled over, she noticed something odd. The window was open slightly. She was sure it had been closed before she went to sleep. A chill ran down her spine. "Jason?" she whispered, her voice cracking as she tried to get his attention. Jason mumbled in his sleep but didn't wake up. Emily stared at the window, wide-eyed, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the terror that had gripped her chest. When she opened them again, the whispering had stopped, but the room felt heavier. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, reaching toward the bed. And the smell, a faint scent of roses, sickly sweet and metallic, clung to the air like a fog. That was the first night. By the third night, Emily could no longer ignore the strange happenings. She was waking up every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the same soft whispers, growing louder with each passing night. Sometimes the whispers didn't stop. They grew into an overwhelming chorus, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible but heavy with malice. And always the roses, the sickly smell of them, grew stronger. One morning, after another sleepless night, Emily decided she couldn't take it anymore. She was going to find out what was happening. Jason had already left for work, so she was alone. She walked through the apartment, trying to steady her shaking hands as she inspected every room. There was no source for the whispers. No window open, no air conditioning vent blowing anything into the air. It was as though the apartment itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with her own uneasy heart. And then, when she reached the living room, she saw them. The roses. They were on the coffee table, exactly where they had been before. Except now, they weren't just a bouquet. They were a forest. The stems had grown, twisting and sprawling across the table, their thorns now as long as knives. The petals, once beautiful and vibrant, had darkened to a sickly shade of purple, almost black. They had multiplied, spreading out like a web of corruption, their sharp, jagged edges glistening in the dim light. Emily recoiled in horror. There was a low hum now, a deep, resonant thrum coming from the roses. It was as if they were vibrating in unison, their roots growing deeper into the very foundation of the apartment, as though they were trying to break through the floorboards. The whispering voices began again, louder now, clear. "Emily." Her name, it was unmistakable. "Emily, come closer." She took a step back, but the room seemed to close in around her. The shadows stretched longer. The walls seemed to pulse like the heartbeat of something ancient and malignant buried beneath the apartment. And then, the roses moved. They shifted, the petals trembling as if waking from a deep sleep. The stems writhed, twisting toward her like fingers reaching for her skin. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. "Emily?" The voice was louder now, a whisper, but it felt like it was coming from inside her head, from everywhere. The roses on the table swayed in time with the whispers, their petals opening wider, as if to swallow her whole. And then, from the shadows, she saw him. Leah. He was standing in the doorway, his eyes empty, his face twisted into that same sickening, grotesque grin. His body was thinner now, too thin, his clothes hanging from his frame like they didn't belong to him. His smile was stretched too wide, his lips cracking at the edges. There was something wrong with his eyes, something dark, something otherworldly. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," Leo rasped, his voice low and guttural. This place is never empty, never alone." His words hit her like a physical blow. Her chest tightened. The roses pulsed in rhythm with the sound of his voice, their thorns twisting, reaching out toward her. She screamed, but it was as though the sound was swallowed by the apartment itself, absorbed by the shadows. There was no escape. Leo's form seemed to stretch, his figure flickering in and out like a malfunctioning television, his body twisted and contorted unnaturally, bending at impossible angles. "Namina, don't run, Emily," he said, his voice now both everywhere and nowhere. "You can't, you never can, you are already ours." The roses surged forward. As Emily screamed, the world around her seemed to bend, the apartment collapsing into itself, the walls closing in, the shadows thickening, the whispers deafening. The roses wrapped around her legs, pulling her toward the coffee table. Her skin burned as the thorns sank into her flesh, drawing blood. The apartment itself was alive, hungry, its roots tangled in her veins, pulling her deeper into its grip. In the distance, Leo's laugh echoed through the walls, hollow and terrible. And as she was swallowed by the roses, her vision blurred, her body pulled into the ground, she realized too late, she wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. The final revelation, it was days before anyone came to check on Emily and Jason. The neighbors grew concerned, but when they knocked on the door, there was no answer. The apartment stood silent, the windows covered, the shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. The roses on the coffee table had grown further, their roots burrowing deeper, and in the center of the table, where they had once bloomed with vibrant life, there was only silence. But the whispers remained, and somewhere in the depths of the apartment, Leo's grin watched over it all. The end, but not quite. The building at 312 Oakwood Lane remained eerily quiet after Emily and Jason vanished. The landlord had grown concerned when the couple missed their rent payment, but when they came to investigate, they found nothing. The apartment was undisturbed, save for the faint smell of roses that lingered in the air, sickly sweet, like something rotting beneath the surface. The police had been called in, but even their investigations came to nothing. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, no traces of Emily or Jason. The building was now notorious for its strange history, a place where tenants came and went, but none stayed long enough to leave their mark. And each time someone new moved in, the same pattern repeated itself. It wasn't until several months later, when a new couple, Samantha and Dave, moved into 312 Oakwood Lane, that things began to shift again. They were excited about the apartment, about the idea of starting fresh in a new city. The rumors about the building didn't faze them. They laughed them off as urban legends. After all, they had both grown up hearing ghost stories, and it wasn't as though they believed in them, but the moment they stepped inside the apartment, the atmosphere changed. There was an overwhelming sense of wrongness in the air. The air was thick, as if it had been waiting for them. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop. A chill slithered down their spines, but they shrugged it off, attributing it to nerves. The first night was uneventful, though Dave couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the apartment, watching them. In the moment las asesinas andas het hundik, Anaji was a brutally abused woman. Her family were homicidal, and he would have sworn the silence was too thick. Like something was waiting for them to fall asleep so it could begin its work. And when Samantha woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint whispers, she thought she'd imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe the old pipes, She tried to convince herself of that, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that clung to her skin, making her feel as if she were suffocating. She had the same feeling she had experienced ever since she had found the bottles. In the lake Acopando, they brushed it off, and the next few days passed in a haze of work and settling in, but every night it grew worse. The whispers weren't just at night anymore. They followed them, seeping into their conversations, making them uneasy when they were alone, making it hard to concentrate, to feel normal. The apartment silence was almost too heavy to bear, and when they did speak, it was as if the walls were listening, waiting for them to reveal something. Samantha was the first to notice the roses. They had been in the living room, a simple bouquet, sitting innocently on the coffee table. But now they seemed different. There was an unnatural sheen to their petals, like the blooms were wet with something, their surfaces gleaming in the dim light. The roses looked alive, alive in a way that made her skin crawl. The way the stems cooled, the way the thorns stretched, elongating as if they had a mind of their own. They hadn't bought the roses, they hadn't even seen them delivered, but they were there. And they weren't leaving. Samantha tried to ignore them, but every time she walked into the room, she felt the weight of their gaze. The roses seemed to watch her, their petals opening wider, unfurling like hungry mouths. On the fourth night, when the whispers began again, Samantha couldn't take it anymore. She went into the living room, determined to find the source of the sound. Her heart raced as she approached the roses, which had grown again, stretching out toward her. Their thorns had lengthened, now jagged and vicious-looking, coated with some kind of dark substance that shimmered ominously. She reached out toward the bouquet, her fingers trembling, but as soon as her hand brushed one of the petals, a sharp pain shot through her palm, as if the flower had pricked her. She yanked her hand back, but the pain didn't stop. It spread like fire through her veins, a sharp stinging heat that made her gasp. "Dave!" she cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the thick air in the room. She looked down at her hand and saw dark, inky tendrils creeping from the spot where the rose had touched her skin, swirling up her arm like living shadows. The tendrils were cold, like the touch of death itself, and as they crawled higher, she felt something pulling at her chest, a pressure in her lungs, as if the air itself were tightening around her. But it wasn't just the pain that terrified her. The roses were moving. They were breathing. She stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest, but the flowers seemed to follow her, as if drawn to her presence. Her gaze darted across the apartment, and her eyes widened as she saw the shadows in the corners of the room begin to shift, moving like liquid, forming shapes that weren't quite human. They pulsed with a rhythm that was both alien and familiar, as if they were responding to her fear, feeding off it. Samantha spun toward the door, but when she reached for the handle, it didn't open. Her heart sank as she realized she was trapped. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on her. The air thickened and the whispers intensified, louder now, closer. "You belong to us." Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing. The floor seemed to shake beneath her feet, and she fell to her knees as the roses stretched toward her, their vines wrapping around her ankles, their thorns digging into her skin. The dark substance from the roses seeped into her veins, burning through her blood like acid. "Daima!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Help me, please!" But there was no answer. The shadows in the room grew darker, thicker, until they were almost tangible. From the darkness, Leo's figure emerged once more, his hollow eyes gleaming with that same twisted grin, his body contorting in unnatural angles as he moved toward her. "You're too late," Leo whispered, his voice like gravel grinding in her ears. "You're already ours, Samantha. The roses are us." Samantha's mind reeled. The roses? Leo? This place? It wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on the souls of anyone who dared to live there, dragging them down into its depths. The apartment wasn't just a building. It was a prison, a vessel for something ancient and evil, and now she was part of it. She had been marked, like all those before her, and then the roses surged. They closed in around her, the thorns sinking deeper, ripping through her flesh, and she screamed as the darkness swallowed her whole. The blood-red bouquet, the unseen witness. Months passed, and the apartment at 312 Oakwood Lane stood vacant once more. Its walls were silent, its shadows still. The whispers had stopped, at least for now. No new tenants had dared to move in. The building's reputation had become too much of a curse. But there was one thing the neighbors still whispered about in hushed tones. The roses. They were still there, on the coffee table, sitting untouched, waiting for the next soul. The end. Or perhaps it's just the beginning. It had been several months since Samantha and Dave had disappeared. 312 Oakwood Lane stood silent once again, as if waiting for something. The apartment complex itself had grown notorious in the city, its dark history now a local legend. People whispered about the tragic disappearances that seemed to plague every tenant who moved into that cursed space. But as time passed, the legend became just that, a story. A warning to newcomers. A bit of ghostly gossip, but there was one thing that was undeniable. The roses. They had become the apartment's signature. No matter who moved in, no matter how many tenants came and went, no matter how many attempts were made to clear the place out, the roses remained. The bouquet in apartment 312 never wilted. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Growing thicker and more twisted with each passing day, their thorns as sharp as knives, their scent foul and overpowering. And then, one cold February morning, a new family moved into the building. The Dunhams, a young couple with 2 kids, had been struggling to find a place to live after their old apartment had flooded. They were eager to start fresh, to put the mess of their lives behind them. The landlord, who was more than happy to fill the vacancy, assured them the apartment had been refurbished. But there is something off about the place. Something that made the hair on the back of Mrs. Dunham's neck stand on end the moment they crossed the threshold. Still, they were determined to make it work. They were a family. They could handle it. The first week was uneventful. The children, Olivia and Ethan, ran around the apartment with excitement, exploring their new home. The space was large, airy, and, despite the odd feeling it gave Mrs. Dunham, she forced herself to ignore it. After all, she had a family to take care of. After a while, Ivan refused to skink alone in his room, guarded a plathrock, and started back to his home. Dunham thought, "Vieten Alexis." They started back to his home, guarded the plathrock, started to warp the effect of the mask. The whole space was uneventful. She had to stay strong. But on the second night, it began. It was just after midnight when she first heard it, a soft scratching at the door. She thought it was nothing at first, maybe a squirrel or something from outside brushing against the wood, but the scratching grew louder, more persistent. And then there was a whisper. It was so faint she could barely hear it, but it was there. "Olivia?" She stiffened, the sound like a ghostly sigh against her ear. She opened the door to check on her daughter, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, save for the shadows stretching across the walls. But that night she noticed something strange, the smell of roses. Faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. The next morning, she went into the living room and stopped short. There, on the coffee table, was a bouquet of fresh red roses, their petals still glistening with moisture. Similar feasts, they were beautiful, almost too beautiful, like something out of a fairy tale, too perfect to be real. But the longer she stared at them, the more unsettled she felt. The thorns were sharp, darker than any roses she had ever seen, and as she reached to move the bouquet, the petals trembled. It was almost as if the flowers had felt her touch, like they had been waiting for it. She pulled her hand back, but the flowers seemed to beckon her closer, their fragrance too overpowering to ignore. Achilles, what is it covering? Is it a sandstorm, a dawn with the messages of the death? Was everything deathly? She hadn't thought of that, but the flowers seemed to beckon her closer, their fragrance too overpowering to ignore. It wasn't just the smell that troubled her, it was the presence, the way the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She thought she heard a faint sound, a whisper in the corner of the room. She turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the apartment. And then she saw them. Tiny scratches on the wall, too small to notice at first, but now that they were visible, they seemed to be everywhere. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling seemed to be etched with delicate, almost invisible lines. Like something had been scratching its way into the apartment, leaving marks that shouldn't be there. That night, things escalated. It was Ethan who saw it first. He was only 6 years old, and the poor boy had been having nightmares ever since they'd moved in. He claimed that he heard someone whispering his name in the dark, but it wasn't his parents' voices. It was deeper, raspier, wrong. "I saw them, Mommy," Ethan said one evening, his wide eyes filled with terror. "The shadows, they were talking to me, they want me to play with them." Mrs. Dunham laughed nervously, trying to dismiss his fears as the overactive imagination of a young boy. But as the days passed, Ethan's fears only deepened. He spoke less and less, his voice hoarse, his eyes wide with fright, as though something had stolen the innocence from him. The nightmares grew more intense, the whispers grew louder, and every time he woke, he swore he could hear the scratching sound coming from the walls. Olivia, his older sister, was similarly affected. She began sleepwalking at night, wandering through the apartment as though she were in a trance. Mrs. Dunham would find her standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the bouquet of roses, her eyes glazed and unfocused. One night, Mrs. Dunham woke up to the sound of Olivia calling her name from the other side of the room. But when she turned to look, Olivia wasn't in her bed. "Mummy, come play with me," Olivia whispered in a voice so cold and unfamiliar that it sent chills up Mrs. Dunham's spine. Mrs. Dunham rushed into the living room, where her daughter stood by the coffee table, staring at the roses with a strange vacant smile on her face. Her fingers were stretched out toward them, as if the flowers were calling to her, drawing her in. Suddenly the air grew heavier and the temperature dropped. Mrs. Dunham stepped forward to pull Olivia away, but the instant she touched her daughter's shoulder, the girl screamed, her voice shrill and unnatural. It wasn't Olivia's voice anymore. It was as though something else had taken over her body, something dark and ancient. "Leave her alone," the voice hissed, and Mrs. Dunham recoiled in horror. "Olivia?" she whispered, but the girl's eyes, her wide, empty eyes, stared at her with an almost knowing expression. And then the roses began to move. The petals unfurled wider, the stems twisting and writhing like snakes. The thorns gleamed in the dim light, dripping with dark, tar-like sap. Mrs. Dunham's heart raced as she tried to pull Olivia away, but the vines of the roses shot out, wrapping around her daughter's arms and legs, binding her in place. A sound, a horrible, guttural growl, filled the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to swell and twist, taking on a shape that wasn't quite human. It was Leo. He stood at the far end of the room, his form flickering in and out of existence, his mouth stretched wide into that grotesque, inhuman grin, as his hollow eyes stared at her, full of hunger. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Leo's voice rumbled from the darkness. "But you can't. The apartment claims everyone." Mrs. Dunham screamed as she tried to break free, but the room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing down, the shadows twisting into grotesque, nightmarish shapes. The roses pulsed with an unholy life, their tendrils wrapping tighter around Olivia, pulling her deeper into their grasp. The last thing Mrs. Dunham saw before the darkness consumed her was the bouquet, alive, feeding, growing, and whispering. The blood-red bouquet, final legacy? Weeks later, the apartment remained empty. The Dunhams were gone, vanished without a trace. The landlord came by to check on the apartment but found the door locked. the windows sealed shut, he made a mental note to call in a locksmith and simply hoped no one would inquire too much about the place. It had become too much of a burden to rent out. Too many disappearances. Too many strange occurrences. But the roses? The roses on the coffee table never wilted. They continued to grow. And deep beneath the apartment's foundation, in the heart of the building, something watched. It was waiting. The building's dark history, no one knew exactly when 312 Oakwood Lane had first begun to attract its curse. The history of the building was like the whispered fragments of a nightmare, unvariable, lost to time. But as the years passed and more tenants came and went, the rumors grew, and the whispers spread throughout the city. It was said that the apartment complex was built on land that had once belonged to a mansion that had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed the fire had been an accident, while others whispered that it was a ritual, a sacrifice to some ancient force. The original owners had disappeared, their bodies never found among the charred remains. As for the land itself, it was believed that it had been cursed long before the mansion was built. Old records, if they could even be trusted, hinted at strange rituals performed in secret, rites that seemed to have been bound to the earth itself. Something dark, something ancient, had lived there long before the city had begun to grow around it, and that darkness had never left. The return of the roses. After the Dunhams disappeared, after the Dunhams disappeared, book. After the First World War, I believe, right before the railroad was built after the time, the town potentially had killers. Its reputation had spread like wildfire, and no one dared to rent it. But eventually the landlord, desperate for tenants and unwilling to keep the place empty, found a new couple willing to overlook the rumors. Jenna and Rob had heard the stories. They knew about the previous tenants, the disappearances, the whisperers, but they were skeptical. They had both lived in old buildings before. Creaky floorboards, drafts through the windows, the occasional strange noise, nothing supernatural, nothing to be afraid of. When they moved in, the apartment felt wrong from the very beginning. The first night was uneventful. The second night, however, was different. Jenna awoke in the middle of the night to the soft sound of whispers, too quiet to make out the words, but distinct enough to be unsettling. She dismissed it as nothing, perhaps the building settling or the wind through the vents. Avans, but then she noticed the roses. They were there, on the coffee table. They hadn't been there when they unpacked earlier. Neither Jenna nor Rob had bought flowers. But the roses were there, fresh and blooming, as though they had been waiting for someone, waiting for them. She stared at the bouquet, transfixed by the way the petals shimmered in the dim light. The roses seemed the longer she stared at them, the more she could feel their presence, like they were watching her. She felt a deep, suffocating weight in her chest, as though the air around her was growing thicker, denser. It was hard to breathe. "Rob," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Rob, wake up, the roses..." But before she could finish, Rob stirred beside her, his face contorted with pain, as though he had been having a nightmare. Rob, his eyes flickered open and he gasped. "Jenna, look," he said, his voice hoarse. Jenna turned toward him, but he was staring at something over her shoulder, his eyes wide in terror. She whipped around, and that's when she saw it. The shadows in the room had shifted. No, it wasn't just the shadows. The darkness had formed. The blackness at the edges of the room was no longer just an absence of light. It had become something tangible, something alive. It was crawling, growing, twisting toward them. She could hear it now, the whispering, softer than before, but full of hunger. "Jenna," the voice rasped. "Rob." The roses on the coffee table began to move. The stems twisted, the petals shook, and the bouquet expanded, the thorns stretching and writhing, reaching toward the two of them. Jenna screamed, but Rob was paralyzed, his body frozen with terror. The air was thick now, suffocating, and the whispers were all around them, no longer just in the corners, but inside their heads. They were coming. The roses surged forward, vines stretching across the floor, wrapping around Rob's legs, dragging him toward the table. His screams were cut short as his mouth was filled with petals, his eyes wide with terror as his body jerked, as though pulled by an unseen force. "Rob!" Jenna screamed, leaping out of bed and grabbing his arm, trying to pull him back. But her hands touched the vines, and the moment she made contact, the sharp, icy cold of the roses shot up her arm like needles of frost, freezing her in place. She could feel it then. The roses were alive, aware. The stems twisted and tightened, and the thorns sank deeper into her flesh, until her whole arm felt as though it were burning, decaying from the inside out. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. Her body was becoming a part of the plant, a vessel for something terrible and ancient. Her mind screamed, but her body couldn't respond. She tried to pull away, but the roses were consuming her fingers merging with their tendrils, her limbs twisting as she was pulled into the mass of petals and thorns. And then she heard it. Leo's voice. "It's not just the apartment, you know," Leo said, his voice distant, distorted, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It's the land, the roses, the heart of it all. You're a part of it now. The building, the roses, they feed on you." Jenna's body convulsed as the vines tightened, sinking deeper into her skin. She could see Rob now, his face pale, his eyes glazed over. His body was no longer his own. He was changing, becoming something else. His limbs twisting, his mouth opening, as if to consume. They were no longer just victims. They had become part of the apartment, part of the curse that lay beneath it all. The final cycle. It was the morning after when the landlord arrived, ready to check on the couple. He had noticed the absence of their rent payment, and given the reputation of the building, he half expected them to have skipped town without notice. But when he opened the door to apartment 312, he was greeted with a silence so thick it made his skin crawl. "Moskinesas poskilsakeyo. Naminasuna shorokani." He stepped inside and immediately felt a shift in the air. It was colder. Unnaturally cold. He looked around, scanning the room. It was quiet. Too quiet. And then he saw them. The roses. They had grown again. They were everywhere. The once beautiful bouquet on the coffee table had transformed into an overwhelming mass of vines and thorns, stretching across the room like a living, breathing entity. The petals were no longer just red. They had blackened at the edges, and they were moving, twitching as though the bouquet itself were watching him. Waiting. The landlord's heart raced and he stepped back. But before he could make it out the door, he heard something, a whisper. His name. "You shouldn't have come." The apartment seemed to pulse. The walls groaned, the floors creaked. The shadows seemed to grow, pulling in toward him like a tidal wave of darkness. He could hear faint footsteps behind him, scratching, dragging, the sound of something dragging across the floor. He turned around, and there they were, Rob and Jenna. Their bodies were contorted, twisted beyond recognition. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, but their mouths were full of roses. "Join us," Leo's voice whispered from the shadows. "You're next." And then, as the roses surged forward, as their tendrils wrapped around his legs, his arms, his throat, the last thought the landlord had before everything went black was the scent of roses, a sickening, overpowering stench that consumed his every sense. The end. Or perhaps just another beginning. The cycle continued. The roses waited, the building waited, and it was always hungry.